The question of which type of school or student should focus on character strengths and skills often comes up in this discussion. KIPP students, by and large, are from low-income families, and people often bluntly ask, is this just for poor kids or public school kids? The research says no, and so does Domininik Randolf, who heads Riverdale Country School, an elite private school in New York City. When I first met Dr. Seligman in 2003, Domininik was also there. We were both trying to figure out how to take a more structured and scientific approach to character that would help more and more kids pursue choice-filled lives. Here's an excerpt of a recent conversation Domininik and I had on the power of character and the concept of flourishing. You once said something about, described some of the kids you've worked with as fragile thoroughbreds.
Yeah.
And say more about that.
I'm really concerned about the kids that are actually performing really well given our metrics at Riverdale. So the kids that have the highest GPAs, who are going through this school, always succeeding. And I worry that in some ways the message that they get is, it's all easy, everything's been fine. And for some of those kids, it's really super easy. And the trouble is that they're going to reach a point in their life where it's not easy. And I think that those kids actually have like the sort of Dweckian fixed mindset. And that's a really dangerous thing, I think, to send kids out into the world with. The question is, how do you confound those kids?
Right.
That's
what I was going to ask you.
How do you create systems in a school that confounds that easy belief that everything's perfect and everything's been fine and I'm always going to be an A student? And I think that's sort of an interesting question, especially when you have the pressures of college admission and the colleges are looking for these perfect transcripts. That, I think, is sort of an interesting question, because what I'm interested in is the delta, right? So I'm interested in growth, right? And yet, unfortunately, the college admission system is not actually looking for growth right now, and that's a big problem.
There is a perception, what you and I both would consider a misperception, that the work around these type of character strengths seems more necessary or more needed in schools serving predominantly low-income kids. Part of that is rooted in the fact that there's an assumption that college is a given for the students who come to Riverdale, and inherent in KIPP's mission is, preparation for college and career. And for so many of the kids that KIPP serves, they will be, the first or among the first to go to college. Explain your views on why you felt at a school like Riverdale it was so essential.
I had worked in a variety of different international schools, and then at the Lawrenceville School down in New Jersey, and it was a boarding school, a high school. But even in schools that had this, some of the greatest schools that have this sense of a full life for the child, and you see students in let's say a residential house, and you see them on athletic fields or on the theater stage, and you see them in classrooms, there still seemed to be this sort of lack of binding concept around that connected those different parts of people's lives. And so, whether it's in a boarding school or a day school, I think still there's this notion of, does the actual academic work lead to something that's part of you? How does your social life develop this sort of sense of integrity of the individual? How do you frame that and get an understanding of that? And so I was looking for people that were actually bringing hard-nosed scientific research to that idea of human endeavor, character development. How do you bring a sort of wholeness to schools, and a way of communicating that wholeness to students, faculty, and parents that would make sense? I also think there's sort of like maybe that sort of fragile thoroughbred thing. There's a disruptive quality to this. So you can go through, and if you're coming from, if you've got a life that's pretty easy, and there are lots of things that are done for you, and you come to a place where you feel very comfortable and you get reinforced in that comfort. This is a way of sort of disrupting a bit that comfort level. And I think that's sort of an interesting thing and an interesting question. And I even think parents of all different backgrounds, are actually asking that in relation to their kids. They're sort of, especially people who can offer their kids a certain amount of ease or facility in their lives, they're starting to think, well, wait a minute, am I actually providing my kid with the type of capacities they'll need to survive and thrive in the world that we're living in, which is sort of volatile and sometimes pretty crazy.
So what advice would you have for any school leader who is thinking about it and embarking on this character work?
Yeah. So one of the things that I think that I was fascinated by when I started learning about KIP was, even prior to you beginning the sort of research in this, is how much you made character a part of the mission of the school, along with the academic side of things. And so it was interesting, when I came to Riverdale, I asked teachers to say, okay, what are the outcomes of a Riverdale education? What would you like to aspire to as outcomes? And I really do believe if you can establish a sort of consensus around institutional outcomes, you can design back the program and the means whereby you get to those outcomes for kids. And so when we did that work, we actually then separated them, categorized them under sort of mind, character, and community. What we realized at the very beginning was we were pretty good on the mind and assessing and evaluating, giving feedback on the development of the mind. We had lots of different tools to look at the health of the community and give people the feedback and work on developing the community. We honestly didn't have much of a definition of character, and we honestly didn't have any really way of giving feedback around character to kids. So that sort of gave us a reason and an impetus to engage in this work in an authentic way for the institution. So I guess I'd say to leaders is, rather than just sort of like adding this on to the other things that you do, how do you actually suffuse this in your schools and make it a part of like the mission of the schools? I think if you're a leader, you need to figure out how do you do that in an authentic way for your certain school or group of schools.